the last 20 years, images and words that artists or writers make have had absolutely no power, given that we're essentially competing against media, in order to create something that reverberates in either images and words. And the fact that if at this point in time, images and words that can be made by an individual have such power to create this storm of controversy, isn't that great? It means that the control of information has a crack in its wall.
An OS is an intermediary, a system which uses both hardware and software to articulate, manage, and execute programs on a device. It constantly communicates, coordinates, decodes, and recodes information. When a device is in operation, it functions throughout all levels and manages the interfaces, which allows users to input data and receive interpretable results. Originally published in 2014, Kara Keeling's text uses emerging discourse from a variety of fields to situate a queer operating system at the center of new media rather than new media's periphery. In her text, Keeling explores how the structures and interfaces which sustain forms of sociality, experiences, and ways of knowing have not been freely formed but have been governed by long-standing norms of oppression and exclusion, especially within the production of media and the subsequent discourse. While she states that the materiality, rhetorics, forms, and ontologies of new media have yet to enmesh themselves thoroughly within the field of queer studies, it is nevertheless important to consider how this intersectional framework can inform and generate a deepened understanding of contemporary life and ideology. Queer OS is as much about cultural logics as it is new media technologies. It is not simply that which functions inside digital devices in queer ways, but rather is a system that operates through the transference of information from the social or cultural level to that of the individual queer body and then back again. The queer body becomes part of the operating system, one which constantly interacts with and is entangled with other hard bodies, soft bodies, programs, algorithms, and devices out in the world. Keeling suggests that Queer OS seeks to make queer into the logic of an operating system of the larger order and to essentially unsettle the structures which inherently and violently dominate, exploit, and oppress said people. While more and more is being written about Queer OS today, in 2014 Keeling was one of the first to recognize media theory's proximity and similarities to queer theory. Many of her contemporaries of the time were researching adjacent areas such as critical race theory in relation to media theory, but hadn't focused specifically on how queerness and sexuality may be employed to better understand how media shapes people and people shape media. Using a similar approach as Tara McPherson in her text, U.S. Operating Systems at Mid-Century, the Intertwining of Race and Unix, they traverse new lines of thought and seek ways to disrupt what we think we already know about new media. In doing this, they demonstrate how cultural signifiers such as race, gender, sexuality are innately tied to technologies and are essentially coded into a device's apparatus. Queer media is continually being created and disseminated. LGBTQ2+ films, television, art, and media alike are now more than ever part of the mainstream and are visible to the general public. With that in mind, queer media differs from Queer OS in that the media is a function of the operating system. Queer media is as much reliant on Queer OS as the computer program is reliant on the OS to run and manage an interface's inputs and outputs. Therefore, every aspect of queer media is relationally tied to the socio-political, historical, and cultural moment it was created in, because the bodies which produce the work are simultaneously running on and interpreting this same data. Here, what is interesting is to think about when the shift of visibility happened. As Vonerovich suggests, the transition whereby information could create a storm of controversy because it was no longer competing directly against media but was working internally to do so. In this sense, queer media functions similarly to that of a virus which enters the host and exploits its normal functions to produce more copies of themselves. Queer OS was previously operating on networks that had only ever been governed by heteronormative and the common sense logic that excluded anything that was not part of the majority's ontology. However, with the rise of civil rights movements and the AIDS pandemic, queer subcultures could no longer be ignored and their visibility proliferated throughout the mainstream. One cultural object that illustrates this is Image Virus, which was created by the Canadian throuple General Idea in 1987. Using the stylized letters from Robert Indiana's famous Love print and sculpture, which was originally commissioned by the MoMA for Christmas cards in 1970, this new work fed off mainstream approval by appropriating visual similarities and penetrating public spaces with the new image. Instead of LOVE, their work spelled AIDS, a blatant reference to the ongoing AIDS pandemic. Image Virus included paintings, sculptures, videos, posters, and exhibitions that traversed normative networks by utilizing mechanisms of viral transmission. The work was spread worldwide, from sculptures being erected in Hamburg to posters being placarded throughout the New York City subway system. The imagery was visible and the message was clear even to those not in the LGBTQ2+ community. Queer people and queer issues exist within mainstream structures whether they want them or not. What appears to be happening is the adaptation and mutation of queer OS, similar to that of a biological virus. As the queer media spread and became increasingly viral, the bodies that queer OS were operating in became socially and culturally more and more powerful and could continue the mass proliferation of the work. It is also important to note that for its initial stages at least, the internet could not be used in transferring the images from place to place. Therefore, knowledge of the image spread through physical networks along cultural circuits. In this sense, the hardware remains relatively the same while the queer operating systems permits new softwares and programs to be executed along these already existing pathways. Without queer OS, Image Virus, along with all other queer-related media, would not exist, let alone be transmitted so widely. Queer OS is therefore influential to not only the LGBTQ2+ community but those outside of it. As we can see, a queer operating system continually extends beyond its boundaries into the normative and uses the pre-established mainstream structure to create and fuel its own production. In essence, differences and othering become a generative resource whereby new queer media is always in proximity to its host, the dominant ideology. Whether this results in content that is in direct opposition to it or not, queer media and its queer operating systems will always be informed and influenced by its host because of its structures which support and sustain them, even when violently oppressing them.